All right, we got a lot of material to cover this morning, so we'll get started. So the next two lessons I'll teach, and then I'll be out of town, and then I'll teach probably 3 or 4 lessons out of the back half of the book. So when we began, just to remind you, we're going to cover every lesson in the first section, and then we're going to pick 2 or 3 in the back section, knowing that we wouldn't have the full time to cover all the material. I would encourage you to cover all this material. Well, you don't have to cover any of it more than you want to. I selected it because it applied to me, and I could learn from it. I picked it up almost a year ago. And this is one of the lessons, one of the reasons I picked this book was this lesson and the next lesson. So again, I'm going to make a broad statement that I don't have the answers to all of this information. I don't have it perfected. I don't do a good job at it sometimes, which is why I picked it to study personally. And then when my name came up to teach, I thought maybe y'all could share from some of my experiences. So attitudes of concern and forgiveness this week, and then next week is dealing with accepting the liberty of other Christians. I think they're tied together. Some of the things we're going to cover will kind of cover both lessons. I'm going to tell you the dust is burning off the air conditioner. I didn't realize it was still on cool till about maybe 5-10 minutes ago. So the heat is coming. So when you get warm, you may get tired of listening to me and go to sleep, but I'll do what Frank does and just hit my ring on the podium to wake you up if I see you going to sleep. But as a review, the next 2 lessons, I think something that I'm going to continue to bring up, and these are just tidbits from every lesson. One of the things you need to continue to remember when we're looking at unity is communicate with one another. Communication is key to understanding and discussing and dealing with other issues with other people. Specifically in the church, it always applies. Don't assume motives. Don't assume you know why the other person is doing anything. And I keep bringing that up again because it's really easy for me to go assume I know why somebody's doing something. So avoid assuming motives. Our word was impugn, which means to put on them their motive. And then unity only comes in the word. So we studied about that in lesson 3 and part of lesson 4. That the only true unity in God's church is going to come from his instruction, from the word. And then finally, agape love is learned, not natural. So that's part of what we're going to start to cover this morning is how do you apply something that's not natural that you have to learn how to do. And your attitude is something that you learn, believe it or not. Whether you've had a good experience with something or a bad experience with something. How many people like McDonald's drive-thru? I like McDonald's drive-thru because I don't have to get out of my car and I don't have to walk in. How many people don't like McDonald's drive-thru? Why? Is it because you had a bad experience? I've had a bad experience. I sat at McDonald's drive-thru for 25 minutes last week. It was horrible. But I didn't have a bad attitude about it because I knew what was coming, which was my lunch. And I didn't have anywhere else to go, and I didn't do like other people did, just start leaving the line and going wherever they wanted to. But attitude is learned, and it's based on our experiences. Can you imagine somebody who has visited a congregation where you've been a member, and they had a bad experience? What do you think their attitude is toward the Church of Christ and all its members? Why is it bad? They had one bad experience. All right, it may be their only one. It may be the only one they ever get.
I heard a comment. One person said, if they don't want to go, I don't care about going.
Well,
Had a bad experience.
and who's the reason for the bad experience? You and them, right? You know, I've mentioned it in this class that, it's been told me that I might argue with a signpost. Well, sometimes, you never argue with just one person. Otherwise, you're just arguing uselessly. People usually look for something or find a catalyst to argue against. So when they have a bad attitude, it's because you were part of a bad experience and they were part of the bad experience, right? Otherwise, they forget about it and move on because it was just them standing there. That's a hard truth to face. Can you always fix it? No. Why not? Who owns their attitude? They do. Who owns my attitude? I do. Okay? So attitude is learned. Can it be changed? I won't say will it always. Can it be changed? Does it take people around you sometimes with a good attitude or a positive attitude, or let's just say a different attitude, to change your attitude? Did everybody around Jesus Christ have a good attitude? No. Did all of his apostles have a good attitude? Not all the time. Why do I bring that up?
Because our attitude might not be what it ought to be.
All the time.
But his attitude was not negatively affected by the attitudes around
Whose?
Jesus.
Jesus's was not. So he's our perfect example. His attitude wasn't affected. Do we find, I would say, human emotion and points of, I would say, depression among the Lord? Was he alone? I mean, when you look at the signs of depression, was he alone? Was he questioning? Was he looking to a higher power, even though he was God Almighty in the flesh? Yes. He was alone. He was isolated. He questioned, even before the cross, he questioned the will of the Father. And he laid his burden on a higher power. I would say he was facing depression. Did he succumb to it? I don't know. I don't think so. But his attitude for what he was getting ready to do for all mankind was unchanged. That's something that I have a lot of difficulty with, a lot of challenge with. So, let's go to Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. Verse 12. Andy Sheffield, do you mind reading this morning? Verses 12 through 17.
And may the Lord make you increase and abound in love for one another, for all as we do for you, so that he may establish your hearts blameless and
I figured somebody else would help me.
Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so that you also must forgive. And above all, these put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called in one body, and be thankful. The word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do, word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him.
Okay, I'm going to start with verse 17. Whatever you do in word or deed, do it in the name of the Lord. Why? Why? Why would I give thanks for it? Is because God gave me that authority to do, or the instruction to do everything in His word and in deed, right? And you do it giving thanks. That's why you do it, is because He told us to do it. Okay, so when you go back up to the beginning of that passage, again, He's speaking to Christians here as the elect of God, holy and beloved. Put on these things. And so the one thing we're going to talk about here is attitude. Well, attitude's not in there, right? All of those things play into our attitude. Okay, so when we move a little bit further, there's the three things we talk about with kindness and compassion and the attitude of forgiveness. I'm going to ask you to have read some of that already, because we're not going to cover each individual point. We just don't have time this morning. So you put on those things. Then verse 13, bearing with one another and forgiving one another if anyone has a complaint against another. Do we complain a lot in our society? Yeah. Do we have problems with other brethren that we complain about? Yeah. Well, I do. You don't have to answer. But if you don't want to answer, might I suggest that that's part of the problem? Remember, I said communication is one of the keys here. If there's a complaint you have and you're not willing to share it with the brother or sister that you have a complaint against or a problem with, or even just something you want to ask about, and you don't talk to them about it, what starts to build up in your mind? A bad attitude. And what has that other brother or sister ever done? Did you assume they had ill motives? Did you assume that they did something wrong, even though you really haven't talked to them about it? I have. But bearing with one another if anybody has a complaint against another. It's real difficult sometimes. So that you only have the bad experience when how many people are involved, or the bad attitude? If you're the only one making the assumptions and you're the only ones interpreting and having the attitude, there's only one person involved in it. Who is it? It's you. So what do? Change your attitude. It's as simple as that, right? Now, let's say somebody actually did do something to wrong you, or something that was misinterpreted, or something that was whatever. You've got a complaint against another brother or sister. How do you deal with it? All right, you go to them, number one. When you go to them, how do you go to them? All right, in love and meekness. What do you assume about the situation before you get there? I already know what the outcome's going to be. This is the argumentative side of my brain. I already know what the outcome's going to be. What's it going to be?
Exactly what you thought it was.
All right. Sometimes you will what he said was it'll be exactly what you thought it was. So the interaction is going to be exactly what you thought it was, because sometimes you will materialize that situation because that's what you think. Anybody ever experienced that before? That when you go into a situation and you've got a preconceived idea about how it's going to go, you will behave in such a way to make that a reality. And you never give the other person the opportunity to actually say what they've got to say and listen to what they're saying. You don't need to listen, because in your mind you've already decided what's going to happen and how it's going to be. And then when you get into that situation, then what is in your mind becomes the reality. Well, who messed up? You did. Because I didn't forbear. All right, I didn't assume the best. I didn't walk into it assuming that, or giving them the opportunity to bear with them. Yes, sir.
Open opportunity. It's no doubt that COVID has hurt the church. But we become very judgmental when someone's not here. We know they're not here because they've lost the faith, but we don't know that. And we need, but have we got, like you said, communication, and there's a golden opportunity here for that, is to check with people that are not here and talk to them and encourage them.
Would you also admit that sometimes they're gonna tell one brother or sister more information than they might tell somebody that they don't have a relationship with?
Exactly.
Yes, Judy.
I was just gonna say, that with love means no evil,
Right.
but we can, it's not love, because we started divorce.
So what Julia said is it's not a display of love when we assume anything other than the best. Agape or phileo. When we fail to display phileo or agape love, we fail. Our attitude is the problem.
Jason,
Yes, sir.
I'd like to point out the other side of that scenario you're talking about. The person that you approach dismisses it as not being real. In one person's mind it is, another person's mind they dismiss it. Then who's at fault there? Could it be the fault of both parties?
Sure.
So that there's a way the person being approached has a responsibility the same as the person being approached. So that goes both ways.
It does.
It's not just one way.
You're right. Go ahead, Ray.
I think this is where the point that you made about communication, because communication also is not a natural thing. You have to learn how to do that, and a lot of people don't ever get to the point in their development as Christians or in life to know that they need communication. If you're navigating perilous waters and you're not by yourself, no matter what the waters are, if it's perilous waters, if you don't learn to very quickly, effectively communicate, your chance of survival goes down.
Mm-hmm.
So life is perilous waters. Christian life is perilous waters if we don't do it correctly, I think. So, yeah, you're right. We have to communicate, and that person, each person has that responsibility to recognize the need to talk to one another to get through that storm.
Right. And we're gonna talk some more about the dismissive attitude next week, because just like with, I'll put it in this type of situation, we share the gospel with a lot of people, and they reject it. Whose responsibility is it to continue going forward and spreading the gospel? It's ours. So sometimes that dismissive attitude is, and I know you're talking about among brethren, that dismissive attitude sometimes is, well, it could be they didn't understand. It could be a miscommunication. So among the brethren, how many times do we continue to go to them until, I'll say, we're heard, or until the point is made, or until we get to a resolution or to an impasse?
The communication is clear both ways.
Yeah. Everybody agree with that? Until your position's understood and their position's understood, and you agree that there's no further benefit, I would say that you're at least at a very clear point of communication. You can both move forward. And we're going to talk about that with Accepting Liberties next week. But your attitude is still the same. Right? I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to forbear. I'm willing to challenge. I'm willing to submit. What am I willing to do? Now, I don't think this is a blank thing that whenever somebody comes to you and asks you to do it, that you have to submit to everything, because you never keep up with all of men's rules that they've placed upon you. Ooh, I got louder. You'll never be able to keep up with all those rules that someone else has asked you to do this, asked you to do that. Well, don't do this, don't do that. And again, at some of those times, you have to communicate again and continue to talk and say, well, I won't say I'm unwilling to fold that into my practice, but it's not a godly practice, it's a manly practice, or a man's mindset, you can make that decision, right? We'll talk about that next week. So back to Colossians chapter 3, go to verse 14. But above all, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. Okay? Does that mean it's perfect? When I love somebody and I display love for every brother and sister in this building, that we're perfect. So we talked a lot last week about defining forgiveness, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more this morning. What does the word perfection indicate there? It's complete or it's mature. That I can go have that conversation. That I can have that expectation that when I talk to someone else, they're going to listen to me, they're going to respond to me, and they're going to hear what I've got to say. And that's the end of our responsibility, right? Because I can't make them change. I have to decide to change. Bond of perfection. What does that bring to your mind? All right, unity. Peace. How many of you in grade school have glued something together? Who, I don't care if you ever went to grade school, who has glued something together? All right. What happens when you put the right amount of glue on? All right. Sometimes it stays together. What happens when you put too much glue on? All right, squishes out. What happens if you're gluing 2 pieces of paper on it and you put too much glue on there? What's it look like when it's done? All right, it's all wrinkly, it got too wet, it's too much glue. It really didn't look good. But did it stick? Yeah, it did. Okay, when I think about the bond of perfection, it's the right amount of glue on the right medium, meaning wood, paper, cardboard, which is paper. It's the only 2 things I guess I really glue together. Super glue. I glued my fingers together. I put plastic models together. I put the right amount of glue in the right place, and it stuck. That's what comes to my mind in the bond of perfection. I've taken the right things and put them together in the right situation, and it bonded perfectly. It's complete. There wasn't a mess. There wasn't anything I needed to clean up afterward, because what happens when you get too much glue and you try to go get a paper towel and wipe it off? What gets stuck in the glue? Paper towel. Looks even messy. Can I go back and undo that and try to clean it up? Yeah. So apply that to exactly how we do. Sometimes it gets messy. And I think here with the bond of perfection, I don't think God really cares how clean the final product looks. But it's how well did we get it stuck together? And did it stay? And did both parties stay connected?
It's a good analogy, Jason.
Hang on. Go ahead, Don.
I was just gonna say, that's a good analogy. What happens when you break a perfect bond of glue? One side or the other is gonna get damaged.
It is.
Sometimes both. Anyway, that's a good analogy.
And when bones heal, it never breaks again where? In the exact same place. You know why? Because the calcification around that broken bone doesn't allow it. It becomes stronger than any other point on that bone. That point never breaks again. Go ahead, Frank.
Endeavoring to keep the unity of the spirit in the bond of peace. It's all about unity.
Mhm. It is. It's all about unity when you're looking at that passage. And then you can look at the benefits, which we're not going to read again because Andy did a good job reading that to us. But there are benefits that come from the proper exercise of that bond. Putting something together that was broken has benefits. All right, let's move over to Ephesians chapter 4. Anybody got any questions?
Just-
Up.
When I was in high school, or grammar school, having a fight with boys, literally fist fights, and after it's over, they're your best friends.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't want to fight with them anymore.
You get over it, you get over it pretty quick. And that's the way boys handle things.
Yeah.
For those of you that aren't boys, you fight about it, and then you just move on. Go ahead.
Just a brief comment about all that. What preceded that too, about put off,
Mm-hmm.
and then become a put on. One of the things about it, these things are not just inherent because you become a Christian either.
Right.
So you have to work at it.
Mhm.
And you may excel in one of these points before you ever even reach the other.
Right.
And you don't just automatically get it because you're a Christian, so. And all of us are at different stages along all of this.
Everybody was called out of what? Out of darkness into light. We are still not the source of the light, right? I know we made that point earlier. We're still not the source of the light. We reflect light. Just learning how to reflect more light is how we get better at these things. So good point, David. That you don't just inherently know how to do that. Attitude and behavior are learned. Right? They're learned.
But when you go come out of darkness into light, there's an adjustment period. You don't all of a sudden,
Well, so what's that adjustment period?
you're learning to adjust to that light and all the things that.
How long is this? What I'm asking.
It depends on the person. It takes Mom longer than it does me because she has macular degeneration.
Well, that's right, adjusting to physical light, but adjusting to the image of Christ. Who's there? Why? Because we're still adjusting, right? We are human. We're never going to be who? We'll never be Christ. We are to work diligently to reflect his image. And the other thing we have to take time in, and the forbearance and the kindness that we have to show, is everybody's at a different point on the spectrum. Everybody's at a different position. We have to understand that. We have to accept that. We have to work with that. I'm at a different point on the spectrum. There are things that I get taught on a regular basis. And it's up to me whether or not to accept it and change. Ephesians 4 and verse 32.
Be kind to one another, tender heart, forgive each other, just as God in Christ also has forgiven us of you.
All right. So I'm not going to talk about forgiveness right now. We are going to talk about it. Be what? And I'll say it out loud because I've shared it with some of you. Members of the Church of Christ are carnivores. We are the most critical on our own members. Sometimes we will chew each other up and spit each other out without an ounce of kindness. Tell me I'm wrong.
What happens in families too?
It does?
Sometimes you treat your family worse than you do other people because they know you. You're comfortable with those people, they know you and you know them, and you know more about each other than you do others. And you feel like you can get away with more than you can with somebody out in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Brother Raymond Harper used to say members of the church are the world's worst about shooting weak members.
Mm-hmm.
There was division in the church over that. One or two good preachers I had a lot of confidence in, and we appreciate it. Sure did wish he could hear some debates with a little kindness on it.
Go ahead, Ron.
You ever taken an airplane ride on an airliner, sitting next to a stranger?
Mhm.
Have you ever had what you come to understand to be the most frank, the most honest, the most open conversation you have ever had with a person
Mhm.
when you're talking to that stranger. Have you ever had that experience?
I have.
I have too. It's revealing about yourself when you realize that it's happening.
Why do you think we do that, Ron? Why are we able to sit by a perfect stranger and bare our soul?
We're afraid of the reaction of the people that we love.
We'll never see them again.
All right, we'll never see them again. We don't have the fear that Ron's talking about of how the other people will react. Why?
Well, as a stranger, we really don't care if they like us or not. Because they're a stranger, you're never gonna see them again. But when it's somebody in your family, it makes a difference. You how they're going to react.
There's no preconceived notions.
All right. How many of you recognize that that's a reality? That at times I can talk to a complete stranger because I have no fear of their reaction. But sometimes I can't talk to brothers and sisters in Christ or people of my own individual family because I fear their reaction.
I talk to everybody.
Well, and I appreciate that about you, Dickie. Does everybody else do that? No? And does everybody talk to you? Do you talk to people that don't talk back?
I look at everybody and come crazy.
Well, all right. So if we recognize a problem, what's the next step? Because it doesn't align with the scripture there, does it? Us not being able to talk to other Christians, it doesn't line up with our communication that we need to have. It doesn't line up with the attitude that we ought to have. It doesn't line up with the forgiveness we ought to be displaying. So we've identified a problem. And I didn't count if everybody raised their hand, but I would say the vast majority recognizes it as a problem. So once you recognize a problem, what's the next step? All right, to do something about it. What do we do about it, Deidre?
You need to start working on your own attitude.
Okay, that's right. You start with me. But what do I need to work on? So, and that's a rhetorical question.
Back to communication.
All right, number one is communication. I need to work on how I communicate, what I communicate, and whether or not I'm willing to communicate. And I will tell you, serving as a shepherd brings that up a lot. Because you ask, and you ask, and you ask, you don't get anything.
Matter of confidentiality, people you talk to need to not pass it on by gossip.
All right. So I would say that's probably one of the predominant fears is the lack of confidence that you're going to tell it to somebody else. But what I've found over time is that they just don't want to share it with you because they don't want any help changing it. That's one at least. They don't want to change. Sometimes they don't want to accept there's a problem. And they don't want to change. And when you approach brothers and sisters in Christ, the very first thing they have to know about you is that you are going to display kindness. And I fail a lot. I would not consider myself a kind person by nature.
But you're working on it.
I am working on it. And you know who helps me more than anybody else? Well, Mama tells me. Who helps me?
Hopefully the scriptures help you.
The scriptures help me. Who's really telling me when I'm not being nice?
Probably the Lord.
My wife is telling me when I'm not being nice. And you know what? It took a long time for me to even recognize that in myself. And part of my realization, my path, was when I got put into management, they gave me unsolvable problems when it came to personnel. And what I found out over time was it was things that people just didn't want to deal with, and they gave them to Jason because Jason would do something about it. And it tended to make me a little less kind, and a little less kind, and a little less kind. And over the 15 years I've been in management, about 3 years ago, I realized that something had to change. Maybe 4 years ago, I don't remember. How long ago was 2017? 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I had to make a change. Did it immediately make me any more kind? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But did I begin to recognize that how I approached people and how I talked to people was not the way that they heard? Does that make sense to you? The way I talk to people, the way I display ideas to people is not the way everybody hears. So I had to start tailoring my language. So I think about it before I went and talked about it. And it changed a lot. In this passage here in verse 32, it says, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. Now I said I wasn't going to talk about it here, and I'm not. I'll keep my word. Turn the page and let's look at forbearance real quick. Then we'll talk about forgiveness. But I want you to keep that in mind. Forgiving those as Christ forgave us. So the second paragraph there under forbearance, and I'm just going to read it and we're going to talk about it for a second. We are to be forbearing with one another, not of punishment. That's God's function. So carrying out the punishment is God's function. So this is why it leads into forgiveness. But with perhaps deserved criticism. Okay? Forbear with one another, not to punish, but at times to criticize or to provide critical feedback. Okay? Judgment is to be held back. That's by us. In the other person's favor, we learn to check our emotions and forbear criticism or public exposure at the time. In true forbearance, the focus is on the other person with care and concern for the other person. How many times have you walked up to somebody and told somebody something or revealed something to somebody because you had a burr under your saddle? You needed to unload. You needed to get that off of your mind, and they needed to hear what you had to say. How many people have walked into an interaction like that? Did it go exactly like you thought it would? Probably.
I had to ask forgiveness.
Did you? Of the person or of God?
Well, the person, and God too.
All right, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. And I asked that for a reason. We're going to come back to that question. How many of us walk into interactions or bring things up because I genuinely care and love about the other person?
Sometimes it's like we're sitting, waiting on somebody to mess up and jump on it. Especially if it's somebody we have a bad attitude about.
Mm-hmm. Or somebody maybe we've misinterpreted because I don't really know them. So when I look at that, so let's talk about that. How many times do we hold back judgment? So let's talk about that Christian to Christian. And we talked about that a little bit already. How often or how quick are we at times to go judge somebody else and tell them what they're doing wrong?
Sometimes really too quick.
I would almost say that we are hypercritical. We're not just critical, we're hypercritical of other Christians. I saw you walk into XYZ store, and they sell liquor, and I know you were picking up liquor. Because because I saw you walk out with a brown bag. I know what you did. What are you doing about it? Yep, that's right. You bought something, put it in a brown bag. You might not even bought it. You might have just picked it up. I saw you go into, I don't care where. I saw you walk into an abortion clinic. So, is that how I would approach that conversation? But do we and have we? That's a rhetorical question again.
I've been on both sides of that,
I have to.
where I had the bad attitude. I was the one that walked into the conversation showing that attitude. And I've been on the other side where the other person can, by their actions, was showing that attitude.
So let's go back to the abortion clinic. So let's say they walked in. Let's say that person had an abortion. Let's say that person's a Christian. Are they above forgiveness? We are talking about murder, but are murderers above forgiveness? God's forgiveness.
God tells us that sin is a sin.
All right. So why do we always go to the extreme case, or why do I always go to the extreme case? Because lying's not big enough to need forgiveness. Right? I mean, that's our attitude a lot of times towards sin.
The man wants to separate the severity.
Man gives severity to sin. That's exactly right. God gives a severity to all sin, and it's condemning in every case. It separates you from God regardless of the sin. So let's say I've got a murderer that walks in the door. Say it was a woman that aborted a baby, or it was somebody that just walked up and shot somebody in the head.
It's no different than somebody who did 16 or 55.
How do I treat them?
Do it.
How do I treat them?
You're supposed to treat it with love.
All right. How do we treat them?
You look down at it sometimes.
To whose demise?
Our own.
I don't think we grasp that a lot of times. Now, you look left and right. You look at the person sitting in the pew, right beside you. Guess what they are? A sinner. You're looking at me standing in the front of the class. I'm a sinner. I need the blood of Christ just like everybody else in this entire world that ever lived on this earth and walked on this earth. I need it just as much, if not more. And the reason I say more is because they may be untaught and unlearned. I'm taught and I'm learned, and I'm a Christian. And I realize every day that I need it more and more and more. Raise your hand if you're a murderer.
You're gonna hate.
Well, all right, hang on, brother man. I got a point here. Who crucifies Christ? Who sins? Because we realize that sin is what crucifies Christ. In my sin, I am condemned. I have to have the blood of Christ. But we don't give that attitude toward other people regularly. As soon as they walk in the door, as soon as we see them out, we judge them and we don't talk to them and we treat them like any other common nobody. And I'm not saying you do it on the regular. I'm talking to myself. I'm not talking to y'all. And I guess I shouldn't say we. I do that. Have done that. Work on doing better about that. I don't forbear good enough. I am not kind enough.
I think sometimes that's an instant reaction to, if you see something like that. Whether they're coming in and out of the liquor store or whatever.
That's right.
You don't know what they're doing, to the point where you could be judging for it.
That's right.
At that point.
They may make a call, sir.
That's true. And they may drink whiskey because they're sick. So that attitude is learned is my point. So guess what I can learn to do instead? React differently. And that's what I'm asking everybody in the room to do. If you're guilty of that, learn to react differently. Teach yourself to react differently. So I'm gonna close the door on forgiveness.
It also puts that person on the offense automatically, you know.
When you confront them, it absolutely does. And when they see you, they're already convicted and they feel the need to give an explanation. So, last two things. Do we hide our feelings from one another? Yeah. To again, our own despair and demise. How can we expect to give or get forgiveness when we're not able to address our own issues? Thought question for next week. Thank you all.